welcome everybody to today's session and webinar on the topic of creating psychologically safe workplaces. This is one of a series of events on Zoom that the Jordan Legacy has run during 2020 and 2021 along the themes of our zero suicide community strategies. And I know a number of you will have been here before. Just some basic housekeeping for anyone who's just arriving now, just to ensure that your microphones are on mute throughout, because we are using Zoom meeting rather than Zoom webinar. And unless you want to be visible on the screen as we are recording the event, feel free to turn the cameras off if you'd rather not, and you will still get to see the screen and the information. For anyone who this is a first time joining a Jordan Legacy event, thank you for being with us today, and to those returning. The purpose and reason why we exist really is down to really Jordan's story. And Jordan is my son, who tragically took his life in December of 2019 after another recent bout of clinical depression. And some of his story very relevant to creating psychologically safe workplaces, because it was just in the lead up to, very sadly, him taking his own life that he opened up and had a conversation with his line manager when he felt, in his view, he's been unfairly picked upon, if you like, for a performance issue, only to discover that upline the management had not completed their element of the project. Such was his frustration that he opened up to his line manager, just went in there and said, look, I'm not happy about this. And I also need to let you know what I'm going through. It was at that moment that his line manager then said, well, I need to explain to you why I've just been off work sick for the last 8 weeks. And the irony of all this is, why does it take that kind of conversation for suddenly two people to open up about their mental health in the workplace? Something else, just briefly, I've had a conversation in the last 24 hours through our website, actually, from a lady called Gillian. And she shared Richard's story, and just really from memory, just very briefly, why I felt it was really relevant for today was that Richard worked for a large nationwide organization. He was a campaign manager. He was 37 when, very sadly, he took his own life in November of 2017, having been suspended from his job role. Really not in a particularly kind way. He was given a printed out copy of the EAP, told not to speak to anyone other than his family, and his family lived some distance away, for an issue from several years before that, as the coroner said in his inquest, could quite easily have been resolved. But such was the trauma that Richard experienced from the way that this was handled, that he got on a train to Southampton, and that evening, having sorted out his will and left a note to his family, he tragically took his own life. Since then, Gillian, his mother, has campaigned and worked very closely with Samaritans and with the trade unions and other organisations, the GMP, to see put in place some significant changes, not least within the company that Richard worked for, in the way that they now communicate any potential suspension. But again, we have to ask, why does it take something and this kind of tragedy for these kind of changes to be put in place? So just kind of positioning why we're here, I think, today, and why this is such an important topic for us. So I'd like to, at this point, hand over to Paul Vittles, one of the Jordan Legacy's partners and my right-hand man, really, in the Jordan Legacy, just to really get today's conversation underway. So Paul, if I can hand over to you.
Sure, thanks, Steve, and thanks for setting that context. Indeed, when we had the launch event in January for the Jordan Legacy, for this series of events, we had the transformation model, and workplace was a key layer in that transformation model. We know that although there are groups of people outside of the workforce who are at risk of suicide, particularly people losing their jobs, most people who take their own lives are actually in the workplace. They are employed. It is a key component that we need to take into account to move towards our zero suicide society and workplaces. So what we're doing today is, trying to get more into this issue about mentally healthy workplaces, and specifically psychologically safe workplaces, and I will probe that throughout our event today. Once again, fantastic panel. We've got occupational psychologist and behavioural scientist Mark Atherton. You can see there, I'm just repeating what's on the screen. Employment lawyer and very prominent active mental health advocate Jodie Hill. Nikki Eyre, who's got particular expertise and insights in bullying in the workplace. Gina from Sellafield, who's become a mental health champion in that very complex workplace. So I don't want to really waste any more time. I want to get straight into this. And the format is, as we've done with a couple of recent events, each panel member, 3 minutes, opening remarks, give us your thoughts, stimulate discussion, and we open it up to questions. We invite everybody to ask questions in the chat. I'll just ask questions which I think naturally flow from the opening remarks. Steve will chip in from time to time. We have got a list of questions that people have raised prior to the event, which we'll refer back to and check off as we go over the course of the 2 panels. But let's go on with our first panel, and I'd invite Mark first to for your opening remarks. Mark, is Mark there? I've got on my screen, I can see.
Yes, I can see Mark there. And I suppose around the question of what does creating psychologically safe workplace actually mean from your perspective, Mark?
Okay, well, just a quick amplification. Occupational psychologist and behavioural scientist, what does that mean? It means my approach to looking at mental health and well-being in the workplace is one that's founded on focusing on the individual and being based on evidence that interventions and assessments that are being done are meaningful and valid for achieving this. What does a psychologically safe workplace mean to me? As Paul mentioned, work is a huge part of our lives. If we look at the concept of a zero suicide policy, work can play a role in supporting people in distress. A psychologically sound workplace is, to me, one where people are able to discuss openly their issues without fear of sanction, and where they believe that they will be properly supported by the organization when they are in distress. So it's not merely, to me, it's not merely the absence of stress, bullying, harassment, which are some of the key problems that can drive people to distress. It's more a positive, creating a positive environment where people feel that they are supported and that they can openly discuss things. And when they do, they will be met with a positive response from both their colleagues and the organization. So to me, that's an important point. Within my own industry, quickly, which is predominantly aviation, we recently drafted for the European Safety Agency 2 definitions of what this means at the organizational level and at the individual level. And that's now being promulgated through the industry as a framework, as an aspiration to which people should move. So for me, it's creating a positive environment rather than simply attempting to iron out the negatives. That's pretty much all I'd like to say at the moment.
That's fantastic, Mark. That's really kind of cued us up nicely in thinking about what a psychologically safe environment is, as well as a psychologically unsafe environment, and the proactive and reactive dimensions to it as well. Jodie, I don't know if you're going to sort of add something from the legal perspective, because this can be a legal and regulatory issue as well, but clearly you've got a lot to bring in your perspectives. Your 3 minutes starts now. You're on mute, Jodie.
That's because I followed the advice of Steve and muted whilst not speaking. Thank you for that. And Mark, yeah, massively agree on both of the areas that you covered there. It's something I've been really passionate about since I had a breakdown in 2017, and that was caused predominantly by work and the fact that the workplace wasn't a psychologically safe place. So this is something that I've been working on for, you know, for me, it's an evolution. It's not, you don't just get a psychologically safe place overnight. But for me, it's part of the culture, and allowing that person, every individual, to be their whole self at work. You know, talking about the things, without repeating everything that Mark said as well, about being able to be really open, and not just about mental health, about everything, you know, sexuality, family, menopause, all of those other things that can impact on our mental health and our well-being. So for me, it's about creating that positive culture that everybody truly, authentically believes is the culture, moving away from the tick box approaches and the tokenistic initiatives that can often be put in place, because actually that doesn't create a psychologically safe place. What it does is it allows people to open up, but they don't have the infrastructure to be supported. So it's about creating something, for me, that's really authentic and is really embedded within the culture, so that people genuinely engage and actually feel safe, rather than simply just existing in the workplace and kind of cracking on with what they've got to do because they don't know who to talk to. I think that was less than 2 minutes, but
yeah, you're very, very good. So yeah, I mean, a lot of important things there which we might want to pick up on. Feeling safe, the emphasis on people feeling safe is obviously clearly significant, and that conversation element, being able to talk about anything in the workplace, I think is something we might want to pick up on as well. Now, Nikki, I don't want to put you in the bullying box, but that's obviously a particular area of expertise. I know you've got more to add in terms of workplace culture and emotional intelligence and all the other areas that you cover. So please give us your opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And can I just say it's anti-bullying, not bullying.
Thank you.
I always like to make that distinction.
Yeah, very important.
Yeah, I actually, sorry, I'm Nikki Eyre from Conduct Change, and we actually work with individuals to help them recover from workplace bullying through our charity side, but we also have a business that works with different organisations about changing the culture, creating those psychologically safe workplaces. My interest in this did come from the fact that I was bullied at work, and it really affected me far more than I realised at the time. It took me an incredibly long time to recover from that experience. And obviously part of that process is that you do reach the point of suicidal ideation. Fortunately for me, it didn't go any further, but for many people it does. And for me, that creating those workplaces, it's all about changing the behaviours in the workplaces. We have some really entrenched behaviours in our workplaces which are no longer fit for purpose. And we also have working practices that are not fit for purpose. So anybody who perhaps speaks up against bullying, what we actually see is they get punished for that. The majority of people who speak up actually end up leaving their job. And so when other people see people being punished for speaking up, that is not psychologically safe, and that will prevent people speaking up, not just about things going wrong, but even bringing forward great ideas, you know, sharing new ways of doing things that can really support the business and the industry. And so actually when we're looking at a psychologically safe environment, then we're looking at a culture where people are included from the outset. That sense of belonging is so important, and it absolutely underpins everything. That they feel able to learn not just about their role, but about each other and about the culture in the organisation, to contribute and really feel valued for their contribution. But most importantly, they're able to challenge, they're able to speak up and not have a fear of retribution and humiliation when they do that, because what we're not looking to do is take all of the challenge and the conflict out of the organisation. We're looking to make it about subjects and not about personal attacks, and I think that's really, really important. So I will keep going forever if you don't stop me, Paul, so I will pause there to let everyone else get a word in.
Thank you for your self-awareness. That's great. Everybody's being very well behaved here. So I'm keen to hear Gina's opening thoughts, and then we've got lots of questions we want to get into. Gina.
Hello, thank you, Paul, and hello, everybody. I'm Gina Vickers. My background is in chemical engineering, and I work on an effluent treatment plant on the Sellafield site, which deals with radioactive discharges. So you might be thinking, why on earth am I here? It's not my area of expertise at all, psychologically safe workplaces and mental health and suicide aware and prevention, but it's something that I do care deeply about and completely recognise the importance of. And it's very important for me to say at this point that for the purpose of this panel discussion, that these views are my own, not Sellafield. I'm not representing them for this. But I'll use this little opening thing to sort of set the scene of my own workplace, because I'm hoping to be able to give a sort of view from the shop floor kind of approach to the discussion today. So, very large, complex nuclear site in an isolated rural location up in West Cumbria. We have 11,000 employees. 73% of them are men. 7,000 people attend the nuclear site every day to do lots of it's like operations, shift-based work. We also have a lot of construction. We are incredibly heavily regulated for obvious reasons. Consequences quite high if something goes wrong. So hopefully that sets the scene a little bit. I joined the company in 2017, and even in that period of time, I've noticed real positive change in the whole mental health arena, from being a sort of quite a taboo to trying to break down the stigma. And I think the catalyst for that was a survey which was carried out in 2017, which had some pretty significant areas for improvement identified, particularly around bullying and harassment, and feeling like you can speak up. So yes, there's been improvements, which has been, really positive to see, but there's still some definite gaps, and I do believe that we've got a little bit further to go before we can sort of call ourselves a psychologically safe workplace. I do have more to say, but hopefully it'll come out in the questions and stuff, so I'll leave it there if that's okay.
Thanks, Gina, and thanks panel members for those opening remarks. There's already some questions which I've noted I'm going to come on to in the chat, but I want to start with, we decided to call this event Psychologically Safe Workplaces, and a lot of people instantly knew what that meant and said, some people said we work in that area. Some people questioned it though, said they hadn't heard the term and they weren't quite sure what a psychologically safe, or indeed a psychologically unsafe workplace is. So do you want to just can you give us some examples, and any of the panel members can come in on this, and don't feel that you all have to contribute to every question, but can you give us some examples of, from your experience, where you can describe a situation or a workplace where you think it's been psychologically safe or psychologically unsafe? And we did actually pose the question, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? So that's kind of wrapped up in that question as well. Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I could do this out of very recent personal experience. Somebody that I have been working with needed to make a transition in his working relationship with his organization. It was slightly outside of their normal policy and procedure. He was having to relocate because his wife was moving. And he approached the organization, and effectively the response of the organization was, well, we can't do that. And additionally, we've been reviewing your timesheets during lockdown, and you haven't been completing them properly. So we're slightly concerned. So instead of the response of the organization being, what can we do to help? It was, you've posed us with a problem that's slightly outside of our remit. We're unhappy. So what we're going to start doing is sending you emails pointing out that you haven't been completing your timesheets properly during lockdown. And his immediate response was to feel threatened and to an extent bullied. He felt his line manager was using, his lived experience was bullying language. So he is now extremely unhappy because he feels that the organization is not recognizing his situation. It's basically running on a procedure, and the procedure doesn't admit of what he's doing, and therefore they're shifting the responsibility for his situation entirely onto him. And he feels very, very anxious. So that's what I would call a psychologically unsafe work environment. And a comment he made was, I don't see how I can ever have trust in my line manager again. So that's what I would call personal.
Yep.
On a very personal level, I've had a couple of major sort of life events, bereavement and near bereavement in the very close family over the last month or so. Was struggling a bit, coping with that till a couple of weeks ago. And I phoned the MD of the organization I was working with, explained the situation, And she just said, not a problem. Understand exactly what can we do to make it easier for you at the moment. And I said, well, one thing I could do with is an extension on a deadline for this piece of work. And her response was, absolutely, no problem. Pick a date you're comfortable with, work towards that. And if there's any other issues that would delay it or anything else we can do, give me a call. And then she said, can I send you a virtual hug? Which,
Nice.
you know, I just said, brilliant, thank you so much. And that just made life so much easier for me. So that's, to me, what I would define as a microcosm of a psychologically safe workplace.
Sure.
So, I mean, you know, 2 examples from my own experience, and hopefully that will help.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Nikki, if I can just direct the question at you, because it's related to a question in the chat as well about when people are being bullied. And we actually heard examples at previous events about people experiencing bully harassment and trying to seek support and actually being bullied and harassed by the very people they were trying to seek support from. I mean, you must have lots of examples of this from your work. Can you give us some examples of what you consider to be a psychologically unsafe work environment?
Yeah, I think what Mark just described there is absolutely right, where actually when people are trying to speak up and get help or get support or ask a question and they're actually being undermined, they're being humiliated, they're being belittled, they're being told that they're wrong, they're having performance issues brought against them, which are not, there's no real evidence to back them up. So I think somebody asked about, you know, what is workplace bullying? And it's a huge spectrum of behaviours. And I think this is where we have to really understand that actually for some people, it's a very small, you know, it's a roll of the eyes, it's a glance across the table at somebody else, it's a little snigger, it's those microaggressions that if they're not stopped in the moment, develop into a pattern of bullying behaviour. At the worst, it's the gaslighting, it's making people, you know, doubt themselves considerably in terms of, did I really say that? Did I really do that? Have I not got that right? Or other people taking credit for their work. There are so many different examples that actually it's very hard to define what it is. But I think one of the biggest problems we have is that at the moment, if people come forward and actually try and speak up about bullying behaviours, they get directed towards formal processes. And those formal processes are not fit for purpose. And once they get into them, then that is where the damage is really done. That is where most of the trauma occurs. And that is what we need to move people away from and put those support processes in place earlier, that early resolution. But that involves an awful lot of development in terms of the emotional intelligence of the people around them, allowing people to move towards the problem and offer the help without waiting for people to speak up and have the onus on them to bring it forward as well. So yeah, it's a huge shift, I think, in terms of the whole culture of the organisation that is needed and the behaviours in organisations. But also please do not go to those formal processes because they are so damaging. And I'm sure Jodie has seen the other side of that far too many times.
Yeah, and I've experienced that exact same thing just this last week of the formal processes being so unhelpful. Jodie, you mentioned about changing the culture as well earlier, and I want to get on to the positive things that we can do, but just while we're on the problems and defining the problem and what is a psychologically safe environment, have you got some examples that you could give to illustrate it? You're on mute again, Jodie.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of examples. I think, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what's already been said, but I think ultimately one of the things that I'd said right in my opening was, you know, if someone opens up and there isn't the infrastructure to support them, that is a really big problem, because often what employers will do is that with the best will in the world, they'll put on some initiatives, they'll have a couple of mental health first aiders, but then someone will then open up in the mindset that actually, okay, my employer knows what to do. And then it's either that information is misused against them or they're not supported. No one ever checks in with them again. It's kind of, it's about what they do with that information, I find as well, because it's very, very difficult to open up once you know, when you're going through it anyway, it's already very difficult. But then to tell your employer, and when they misuse that information in any capacity, that creates a really psychologically unsafe place for that individual. And it also, like you mentioned, you lose the trust, and that's really important. When you're mentally unwell, you're already feeling, you know, quite vulnerable. So, you know, creating that psychologically safe place is for me, it's about, so the way that I've done it is, you know, looking at things like being really open about my own mental health, about my issues, so that when my staff do the same, they know I'm actively listening to that, rather than it's just being, you know, I'm listening, but I'm not going to do anything about it. So it's about what we do with the information and how we handle that, as well as simply just creating initiatives that might look like it's a psychologically safe place, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Jodie. Gina, I just want to, if you don't mind, use you as a bridge here from the negative into the positive. So any comments you've got to make on instances of maybe what might be a psychologically unsafe workplace, and then starting to get us into what can be done to create psychologically safe workplaces?
Yeah, there's been some really interesting points raised already so far, which I'd love to talk more about, but I'll try and keep on topic. Because what helps me imagine psychologically safe workplace is I'll stick to what I know. I understand safety. So what's a safe workplace to me? Because I feel safe going into work, because I know that it's people's jobs to keep me safe and secure. And I know that when I start a task, I'll do a risk assessment, I'll follow some predefined method statement, I'll have all the PPE provided to me and all the tools that I need to do the job properly and safely. And afterwards, we'll have a post-job review about what went well and what we could have done better in the name of safety. So if we think about putting the psychological word back in there, I want to be able to identify and mitigate hazards to psychological safety when I'm at work. I want people around me, like my line manager, to be suitably qualified and experienced to be able to handle psychological safety risks and hazards, etc., which I think is where we've just touched on it there, Jodie. The mental health first aiders, we call them mental health champions, just different. It's exactly the same thing. They're really good people to be able to notice the signs. But I think the problem that we have is that if they're a signpost to outside infrastructure that you could direct someone in a time of crisis, or if they need more help than a mental health first aider can give, Cumbria doesn't have that really. And I don't think as a company we feel confident in the places that we can direct people. Yeah, we've got national things which exist and are proven to work, but on a local level, yeah, Cumbria is struggling in that way. So we're also struggling as a company. We don't have that support system for ourselves. So I would really look to see psychological safety ingrained in our policies, procedures and methods in the same way that safety is. Because I think what we've resulted in because of all of that is a really good safety culture. And psychological safety needs to sort of catch up to that. So you've asked what we've done in a positive way to improve. As I did mention in my opening remarks, we've sort of covered quite a lot of ground in the past few years in terms of mental health and breaking down the stigma. So after that survey in 2017, they went all guns blazing. We had so many workshops and presentations to sit through. I sat through role plays about demonstrating how an angry boss at work telling somebody off, and this person goes home and then tells their wife off, who then tells their kids off, and how that stress sort of goes back and affects lots of different aspects of somebody's life, which may be obvious to some, but it was really good for sort of setting the standard that we can talk about mental health, and everybody has a mental health, and we just need to learn how to manage it. And as far as I can see, well, we've done surveys since which have shown improvement, but also anecdotally, there's been a real shift in people talking about mental health. And I think what I've seen is that now we've given these predominantly men the permission and the space to be able to talk, and we've said, yeah, you should do it, they don't stop. they want to get it out, and they've got so much to say. So we've done well, you know, we've done that kind of that bit, but then the next bit of getting people like with more support when just talking to your colleagues and your mental health first aiders isn't enough. we're missing that next bit. And also relevant to sort of this panel discussion, we're missing the link from poor mental health to suicide, and that is still a taboo, and that is still not talked about. And I think there's real work to do in that arena. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's all great stuff. And I want to pick up on the suicide prevention side of it. There's a question in the chat on that, and also about response to bullying. There's a question in the chat on that, which Nikki's probably read. As I said earlier, we're interested in the proactive aspects of this and the reactive aspects. So interested to hear more from you in terms of what you think can be done to create a psychologically and sustain a psychologically safe environment more generally, and then specific measures that can be taken, when there are problems. And I'll open up to any of the panel members who want to contribute on that. We'll come back to suicide prevention specifically, unless you cover it in your answers here.
Okay.
Mark.
I'd like to talk about something that we do in civil aviation. What started me engaging with this whole area was in 2015, when Andrei Lubetz decided to fly his Airbus into a mountain with about 150 people on board as a murder-suicide. Could it have been foreseen? There were indicators, but what the industry did after that was quite interesting. It was made mandatory for all airlines to have peer support programs, formal peer support programs outside of the normal organizational management. And the peers are trained in mental health first aid. They're given instruction into support pathways that they can refer people to. All the peer support programs will have a dedicated clinical psychologist attached to them as a first referral point of call. And from that, they can then be referred through to EAPs or to external resources if it's appropriate. And the reason it works so well is really this question of trust. It's a highly regulated industry. Nobody wants to admit that they have mental health challenges because they're all licensed, statutory licensed, and they're all extremely concerned that admitting that could well cost them their employment. So what's happened is that these peer support programs are now embedded in most organizations. They are entirely confidential and hands-off. They're supported by the organization, but the organization has no control. And an individual who feels that they need more than can be done through talking to a colleague or talking to somebody who has mental health first aid training can self-refer to one of these peer support programs and receive as much support as they need in confidence. And there are rules within the pathways at which point the organization would need to be notified that this particular individual has referred themselves and has reached a certain point. But what it allows people to do is to feel that they have a safe space, that they can go, they can talk to somebody who understands what they are going through, what their role, what their job is. One of the key criteria is the peers have to have experience of their work environment. And it allows people this safe space where they can go, they can receive support, and they can receive referrals through a clearly defined set of pathways to effectively give them whatever help they need to have a positive outcome and stay in their role if that's what they desire. So that, I think, is a very useful component of a psychologically safe workplace, because it gives you that safe space that you can go to and know you're doing it in confidence. And so I think that's a very valuable concept that we could look to in industry. I worked a few years ago, the government spent a lot of money doing the same thing for the blue light services. So fire, ambulance and police all have their own peer support programs in place. And I haven't looked for a while to see how successful they are, But the evidence I've seen is that these provide a very useful step beyond mental health first aid interventions. So yeah, that's one thing I'd like to
yeah, that's a great example. Great example, and obviously a very something we can all relate to, wanting to have a pilot on a plane, if we're on a plane, being very mentally healthy and so on. We've actually got one of our panel members coming up after the break from a police force, so maybe we'll get a perspective on that as well. Joe, did you want to give us your thoughts on how we can create and sustain a psychologically safe workplace, both in terms of the culture? Again, you mentioned culture earlier, and it's obviously that generalized concept has to be made specific to be meaningful. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, is Jodie with us? Possibly frozen up there. Nikki, if I can come to you in the meantime, there was a question from Gal in the chat there about responding to bullying. So again, I mentioned there's this proactive and reactive element, and you already mentioned about the formal process and so on. Well, I mean, what should happen in a psychologically safe workplace? What should happen when somebody is being bullied or thinks they're being bullied?
Yeah, so ideally, then what we would do is we would actually step back and look at the bigger picture, and everybody's case is going to be absolutely unique, because one of the biggest problems with workplace bullying is that you can be on the receiving end of that behaviour for a long, long time before you start to recognise the impact that it is having on you. And once they're at that stage, they're going to struggle to articulate what's really going on. So those conversations are going to be quite difficult. If we have a psychologically safe workplace, the big difference for me is very much about how managers are being trained to manage their staff and their teams. And there's a real need for greater emphasis on the emotional intelligence skills in managers. We're promoting people who are really good at their jobs, but we're not supporting them to become managers. And so that is why a lot of these behaviours occur. So if somebody has a problem with a behaviour, the ideal scenario is you can speak up in the moment and you can say, I'm sorry, I don't find that behaviour or that language acceptable. And the other person recognises that and adjusts their behaviour accordingly. Being able to do that is incredibly difficult, because as humans, we want to avoid confrontation. So that's where actually knowing that somebody is able to be more self-aware about their own languages and behaviours, but also really manage their own emotional regulation as well, and be able to not just lash back at somebody. Because obviously, if somebody comes at us, we are quite often, our instinct is just to lash back at them, and we don't want to do that. We want people who are able to remain calm in that situation. And that's where actually we need a huge amount more work doing on the emotional intelligence of managers and in the teams. And that in itself will help create the psychological safety and the empathy that allows that to occur.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nikki. Jodie, I think we've got you back. They just lost you for a little while.
I don't know what happened then. it kicked me out, it booted me out. But so I'm sorry, Nikki, I missed a little bit of what you said there, but I caught the end. I think for me, creating a psychologically safe place has been something that's been very data driven. So using things like stress and mental health and wellbeing risk assessments. So identifying the individual risk to every individual within the organisation, as well as looking at the wider company risk. And then what you can effectively do by, and I think actually someone from Champion Health who do these risk assessments is on the next panel. But what we found really helpful with the risk assessments is you're not only giving that individual a report for them to look after their own psychological safety, you're actually identifying as a business, where do we need to invest our money? At Thrive, we're a really small organisation. There's like 6 employees. And you don't always have lots of money. You don't need loads of money to be able to do some of these things. And actually, if you do a more data-driven, if you take a more data-driven approach, you're actually addressing the risks head on rather than skirting around the issues. And that applies for both individuals and the company as a whole in terms of the initiatives that you might put on, the support you might put in place. Because often what we find is there's companies put lots of things on and people don't engage in it. And part of that is because that's not what they need. They don't need lots of free yoga because guess what? Everyone's already doing yoga. Or they don't need loads of free fruit because they actually eat loads of fruit. So it's about thinking about initiatives and support that actually really does help individuals. And I suppose it goes back to that culture piece, in that, you know, you're creating that positive culture where people feel that they've been listened to, and that the feedback and the information that they've given has been used in a way that actually reduces any risk to them in the workplace. And then the other thing I would say is about leadership. Is I actually think this is very much a leadership issue, as well as the individuals having to, you know, be there to open up. It's about us leading by example. And I think, you know, it's very difficult for you to create a psychologically safe workplace where you have a CEO or a management team who don't care about mental health. So, you know, leading by example is so important, and it takes people to be vulnerable and to lead by example to really create that shift and that change that we so desperately need in many organizations. So that, yeah, they're the two areas I think that we've really focused on and seen a massive impact. And like I say, as a small business as well, with very, very little funding, that you can make such a big impact.
Yeah, and that leadership is inherent in a lot of the other comments that have been made about leaders that are emotionally intelligent and leaders that encourage open conversations. So that's a really important point.
Yeah.
But I want to come on to suicide and suicide prevention, because clearly this is at the heart of what the Jordan Legacy is there to try and achieve, and where this all started from with Jordan's story and Steve's experience. Somebody's asked a question in the chat about who in the workplace is responsible or should be responsible for suicide prevention. So that's a key question. Gina mentioned earlier about, you know, getting the conversation going around mental health and well-being, but much harder to get the conversation going around suicide and suicide prevention. So I'm interested in giving, I'd like to give the panel members an opportunity to talk specifically about suicide prevention, you know, your experience of this, the issues as you see them, and potential ways forward.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on what I was saying before about mental health first aiders, we've trained everybody in mental health first aid, because that's for me, that's the starting point of being quite confident about talking about suicide. I don't think anyone's really super confident about talking about suicide because it's obviously triggering for so many people, but it's about creating that open space to have those conversations and not skirting around the word. I think the word suicide is often, you know, people just don't want to say the word out loud, and they'll skirt around it and they'll come up with something else to say. But actually just being really direct and really open about those conversations, rather than trying to hide them away or dress them up as something else, is really important. And the mental health first aid training helps with that, because there is a direct conversation around suicide, what you would do if someone you know, appeared to have ideation at work. And so it really does go into some of the skills around that. So we took the view that every member of staff would be trained in mental health first aid as part of our zero tolerance for suicide. So I think there's obviously other types of training that are available, but I do think part of it is about giving people the skill set, because it's something that they're just not used to talking about because society doesn't encourage it.
And that training includes asking the direct questions about suicide and suicide prevention, and very important. Gina, did you want to just flesh out that point you were making earlier about the shift from talking about mental health and well-being into talking directly about issues like suicide and suicide prevention?
Yeah, if you don't mind, because as I said, that's that link between poor mental health and suicide is missing for me. And the fact that suicide is sometimes the ultimate price of having poor mental health. I'll just share an anecdote about, so Mind come in and run like a series of workshops for us on various different topics to do with mental health. So they have stress, anxiety, depression, and they also run some on suicide. The stress, anxiety, depression ones are oversubscribed. They have to just keep on running them week on week. People are really interested in the topic and educating themselves about it. Suicide ones are undersubscribed. I went to one and there was a few people there, all women. So potentially just because you've got suicide written across the top of it, people aren't going, they're avoiding that conversation, complete swerve. And the fact that it was all women sat there makes me think that this is probably not reaching the target audience that it may need to.
And this is in a male-dominated working environment, isn't it?
It is, exactly. So I think that in itself just shows that we're still sort of not addressing suicide, and perhaps people are not ready for that conversation. So if they're not going to come to us to get educated about it, I really just think it has to be mandatory, particularly for line managers. You know, we've got 4,000 of them, and just to build on what Nikki was saying, my line manager, for example, doesn't want to be a line manager, but he wanted a promotion, and the only way to do that was to start managing people. So there needs to be infrastructure within your company that you can progress and be promoted without having to put yourself in a position where you have to manage people. He's not a bad manager, but he'd prefer not to do it. It's not his interest. People isn't his interest at all. So they need to have the training and education so they at least know how to have the conversations. And I think a telltale sign is the language that people are using. Are they able to talk about suicide properly? Are they saying committed? Are they saying completed? Are they able to handle people's pronouns if they're non-binary, for example? Are they able to talk to neurodiverse people rather than just like neuronormal people? Because it's so important to make people feel included in the workplace, and to help people thrive rather than sort of like having a poor mental health. So I think the first step would be, well, if I was CEO, it would be a zero suicide plan with mandatory training for everybody. But baby steps, I think mandatory training for at least line managers, it just has to be there.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes before our scheduled break, so I'm just keeping an eye on the clock there. But really interesting and really relevant points here, and I'm interested in that. To what extent mandatory is part of the solution? To what extent it is, you know, being able to get people to buy into this for whatever reason, and also the zero suicide plan. We know some organisations have introduced zero suicide plans and driven the numbers down considerably in environments where there's been a large number of suicides, but also others are resistant to the idea of having a zero suicide plan because they think it's raising these uncomfortable issues. In the time we've got left available, maybe Mark and Nikki can comment, and then Jodie add anything to that.
Okay, I'll take a view. You know, a zero suicide plan is an admirable goal to reach, and absolutely, you know, I agree with Gina. One of the key things is awareness and understanding. You know, a positive work environment is no guarantee that you will not see people die through suicide. A negative psychological work environment certainly raises that risk. You know, one of the key things around that is recognizing the signs and having somebody to talk to. If you feel that you have a line manager that you can talk to, and that line manager has an understanding of what should and can be done when faced with somebody in a crisis situation. If that is understood and accepted throughout the organization and has senior management support, you are far more likely to have a positive outcome. So it does need senior management support, it needs a clear policy, and it does need people to believe that they can approach somebody, and in doing so, that person will give them sympathetic hearing. So in that sense, it's part of this creating a positive culture. It is no guarantee it will always work, but in its absence, you know, the likelihood of an adverse outcome rapidly goes up. So I think it's all part and parcel of the thing. You know, it's almost like the vaccination that's going on against COVID. You know, if you get vaccinated, no guarantee you won't catch it. But if there is a policy across the board, it will help protect a great many people who otherwise would suffer. So for me, it's that model that lends itself to supporting a zero suicide policy. Otherwise, it's just a policy, but without a mechanism, then people will just fall through the cracks, and that's a tragedy.
Nikki, what are your sort of thoughts, just summarising on this?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up a little bit on the mandatory idea, and I think there are more guidelines coming out. So, for example, there's the ISO 45003 about psychosocial risks in the workplace, and Jodie mentioned about risk assessments earlier. And I think it is really important that people start kind of implementing these standards. What for me is really interesting, those are obviously voluntary. But what for me is really interesting is I'm just sitting here now trying to remember if I've read the word suicide in that standard at all. And I will go back and have a look because I don't remember reading it. And yet, actually, why are we not including that word in our health and safety statements, in our risk assessments, you know, in terms of our looking out for different behaviours, our well-being strategies? Why is it not just being automatically included? Because the more it becomes part of everyday language, the more we will start looking out for the signs, as well as the training. And it's actually that kind of infiltration through these messages that can have a huge impact on the way people are ready to receive the information. So I think that's a really important message as well.
Great point, Nikki, great point. Jodie, do you just want to give a quick sort of final concluding remark?
Yeah, I mean, on the point of mandatory, I don't know if anyone's aware, but the mental health first aid, I actually campaigned for it to become mandatory in all workplaces, and it has been read as a bill. I'm also campaigning for the mental health and wellbeing risk assessments to be mandatory, on the basis that the government should provide a really clear infrastructure and some guidance and support to organisations so that there's some consistency. Because a lot of employers, they do want to do these things and they don't really know where to start. And like we're talking about, sometimes there just isn't the resources, and there's a lot of inconsistency with the information that's out there in terms of what you have to do, what's nice to do, and actually having something across the board that is supported by government, for me, would really help with this mission.
Okay, that's brilliant. Mark, very
quick thing. ISO 45003 was mentioned, which is great. Anyone that wants to see what can be done at a national level, the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, CCOHS, they actually have I believe it's mandatory now, psychological health safety management standard for employment. And it's, as far as I'm aware, it's the only one in the world which is designed specifically to provide both data capture for analysis, but also pathways for individuals to be able to create their own tailored support packages. So anybody wanting to look at that, if you look up the CCOHS standard, it's incredibly informative. And I can only go with Jodie. I personally would love to see that made a regulatory requirement for organisations or something similar to that in this country.
Brilliant, thanks, Mark. Okay, we're going to have a break now, but thank you, everybody, all our panelists from this first panel. If you are going to hang around for the second half, please do, and please continue to put comments in the chat as well. We've got another panel. We'll try and pick up on these issues and build on these issues rather than just repeat the same issues, although we'll start with the same kind of open questions. But we need a break, Steve, don't we?
Yes, yeah. Thank you all, to everybody this morning, or this session so far. Just an interesting point just raised just towards the end by Chris, that about the term suicide, and of course we're all aware that the recent introduction of our new Minister for Care and Mental Health, the term suicide was not included in her title, as most people hoped it would be. So it's clearly a word that even at government level they're struggling to include there. But no, thank you all this morning to Mark, Jodie, Nikki and Gina. Fantastic first discussion. Looking forward to the second panel, and we will resume at 14:10.